Let's go over how to troubleshoot authentication problems in the Cisco ASA, both for clientless SSL VPN and also for client-based SSL VPN. These debugs can actually be used for both scenarios. One of the things that actually I always suggest is to become familiar with the debugs, because they can really be your friends whenever it actually comes to troubleshooting, and especially become familiar on how the debugs look whenever things actually work. So in my first example here, I have the debug web VPN followed by a number, which is 255, and again it can go from 1 to 255. The higher the number, the more information that you will get in the debugs. In the first example, I have the output, or a snippet of the output, of a good authentication. So in here you actually see AAA status equals accept, and that the user 1, in this case the actual name of the user was user 1, was authenticated. Depending on the debug, they can actually be very straightforward, and they can provide a lot of information that can be useful. In some cases, they actually can be fairly short and cryptic. So in this example, I'm actually showing that for a bad authentication, we're actually getting AAA status equals error. So at least it's actually giving us that there was an authentication problem that caused this connection to be terminated, and that then after that you actually see callback data is not valid. But you're not getting a lot of information that is really useful of knowing what a specific authentication problem took place whenever the client was actually trying to connect. So you can combine these debugs with other ones, like the radius debug that I'm showing here, on where it can display very detailed information, even the packet decode of the authentication request. And in here you actually can see details of even the source IP address, the actual packet, the raw packet data. The user 1 was actually trying to be authenticated or trying to establish a VPN connection. You see that a radius packet was actually sent to the 172.18.104.83 radio server on port 1645. And then after that, you actually see that the server responds timeout. So the radio server is not responding in this example. So this can actually be because of the communication problem to the radio server. You can, of course, do a lot of other things to troubleshoot the issue, try to ping the radio server, try to see if anything in between is blocking that 1645, that UDP port 1645 connection to the radio server. Let's say a router in between with an access control list or an ACL, or perhaps a routing problem. All those are scenarios where you can actually see things like this, when the radio server is timing out. Or perhaps it's, of course, that the radio server program or the radio server itself is down. There's other debugs, that are fairly similar. This was actually one that is used fairly heavily, which is called the debug anti-domain for LDAP authentication, or actually for domain authentication. There are also other debugs like the debug anti-domain for authentication problems to a Windows domain controller. Again, in here we actually see that an error message saying that the network is down, and you actually see that the anti-domain delete message. There are many other debugs, such as the debug anti-domain debug that you can use for authentication problems or troubleshoot authentication problems. This is an example of the output, and basically it's the same error, but in this case to a domain controller. And in this case we're sending a packet to the 172.18.85.123. It actually timed out in 12 seconds. It actually displays a little bit better message, which is actually authentication server not responding and no further errors. In this example, the administrator was attempting a connection to the Active Directory server using a test utility within the ASDM, which brings me to my next point, which is ASDM has an authentication test utility built in within ASDM, and where you can actually test a connection to the ASA without actually having to ask a user to retry again. This is very useful whenever you're dealing with non-technical users. And here basically it's a quick test that you can do against in my example here, against a radio server, the 172.18.104.83. You can test for authentication or authorization. To do so, you actually click on the test button here. This dialog box will be shown, and you enter the username and password that you actually want to test. In our case, the server was not responding, and it's basically the same error message that you saw previously in this lesson. There's also a CLI option for this test utility, and the command is test AAA server authentication. The actual name of the group, in this case, is called New York Group. The host of the radio server, or the IP address of the radio server, which is 172.18.85.123, and the actual user, in this case, this other example has domain user, and the actual password that you're sending to the ASA. There are a lot of other authentication debugs, debug LDAP, SDI for Secure ID, debug Kerberos, which are also helpful for troubleshooting authentication problems. These are all for your reference, of course. There are many of them. If you're not sure what debug to use, you can actually combine the debugs, or at least start with the debug web VPN and also the debug AAA common. That actually provides high-level debug messages whenever you're actually troubleshooting clientless or client-based authentication problems. So again, these are some helpful tips for the troubleshooting of these connection problems. There are also a lot of other clientless SSL VPN debugs like troubleshooting CIF shares, like the debug web VPN CIFs, or NFS shares, debugs to troubleshoot Citrix connection problems, and also selective debugs like the debug web VPN JavaScript to troubleshoot what we call JavaScript mangling problems. And these are actually user specific, and specifically that these debugs are fairly verbose, so they have a lot of information. So in here we actually want to make sure that we specify a given user that is trying to connect to the ASA. And in this case, the user name is Omar. The show VPN session database is actually a command that we previously covered in earlier lessons. It gives you a summary of everything that is actually happening whenever it comes to VPN in the Cisco ASA. Here you see the active connections, the cumulative connections, not only SSL-based connections, but it can give you information about site-to-site tunnels and IPsec connections as well. The show VPN session database has many options. As you can actually see here, I'm actually showing this for your reference. You can use the command to display session information for any connections. You can use the details to show the detail output. You can use L2L like we used in earlier modules to show IPsec LAN-to-LAN or site-to-site VPN information, and many others. So let's take a look at how some of these debugs actually look whenever we actually try to connect to the ASA. So in this case, actually I'm connecting using the AnyConnect client to 209.165.201.1. That's the IP address of the outside interface of the ASA. And let's go to the ASA. Here we're actually showing or displaying the show WebVPN AnyConnect image command. And in this case, actually you see that it is a valid image. It is a local image that we actually have in the ASA. And it's a Windows-based image. So if we go to the ASA, we can use the debug commands to troubleshoot these connection problems. So let's first enable the debug web VPN AnyConnect command. And we're actually going to be enabling with level 255, so the highest level. Again, the higher the number, the more information that you will get in the debug messages. You can also do the show debug to see all the debugs that were enabled in the device. We already had the debug AAA authentication debug enabled at level 1, and the debug that we just enabled right now, which is debug web VPN AnyConnect, enabled at level 255, or the highest level. Once we actually try to establish the connection, here you can see information, fairly detailed information about the local IP address of the device or the client, the remote host, which is in this case is that Cisco ASA, the DNS name information, and many different other, all other information that actually may be useful for troubleshooting the VPN connection. Here I'm enabling the debug AAA common, and I'm actually enabling the debug AAA common with a level 255 to be the highest level, and the debug web VPN AnyConnect as well. And I'm also entering 255. I go to the client, I hit connect, then the client will actually prompt me for my username and password, so I'm entering my username and password. Then you see the debug message is actually scrolling in the ASA. You see that authentication actually is trying to, an authentication session has been opened, and that the username Omar is actually trying to authenticate to the ASA, but you're actually seeing that timeout to the radio server. So you're actually seeing here that the radio server communication is timing out, and the ASA ultimately gives up, giving you an authentication status that says service down. There's also a utility called the Cisco Diagnostic and Reporting Tool, or DART. This tool actually helps you bundle all the appropriate log files and diagnostic information that can definitely be useful for analyzing and troubleshooting any client connections. Again, this is actually in the client itself. In order to do that, I'm actually going to the Cisco DART, enabling bundle encryption to encrypt the messages and protect those messages, since some of these messages can actually contain sensitive information. And I'm masking the password here. I'm putting an encryption password and then hitting run. Then the DART engine starts, and it actually creates the actual bundle and saves that information in the desktop machine or in your desktop. Then in there you actually see several folders and a summary of all the logs that actually were exported. These logs are really detailed and extremely useful for troubleshooting, and as a matter of fact, some of them may look a little cryptic, and they're very useful for the Cisco TAC to actually troubleshoot any type of connection or installation problem that you have in your system. But here I'm actually showing the summary, just the summary of the DART bundle, and you see that, of course, it has many different sections with not only general information, but also information about the actual files in the system, installation, libraries, and many other things. Of course, the different folders actually have many other files inside of each folder that provides detailed information about all the modules that are installed in the client.